Hello and welcome to another edition of WaveLab Workflows. My name is Justin Perkins. Today we have a special guest, Mike Tucci. He is a Grammy-nominated mastering engineer and fellow WaveLab user. Is that Leslie we have in the background? Is that Leslie we have in the background there?
Oh, Wesley, yeah.
Wesley, I thought you said Leslie. There he is, Wesley. Mike's worked with a lot of great artists such as Chris Brown and Young Thug. DMAs, Midwest with an X, Doja Cat, Corey Henry, Living Color, who has been around for a long time, great band. Snoop Dogg and Nile Rodgers is a newer project. Is that out yet or something that you just worked on? The
I
Snoop Dogg.
literally did that yesterday.
Okay, so that'll be out soon. But Mike, thanks for joining us here on the live stream.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Been wanting to talk with you for a little while, and our schedules haven't been lining up. But we're going to get into a little bit of WaveLab talk, and Mike's even going to share his screen with us to kind of give us a look into how he uses WaveLab and lays out the screen and things like that. I always find it interesting to see how people work within WaveLab because there's a number of ways to do things. But first, I just want to have a little chat about mastering. We're also going to talk a little bit about Dolby Atmos, which is popular topic these days, and WaveLab does not support Dolby Atmos yet. I could see it happening sooner or later, but there are some details I want to talk about, some things that would be good to see in WaveLab. So if you're watching live, feel free to ask any questions in the live chat, and I'll keep an eye on those questions and ask Mike either periodically or just at the end. We can have a kind of rapid fire question and answer thing. If anyone has any comments on the sound or video, let me know. I am not a video producer by any means, but I'm trying my best. So first of all, I just wanted to ask, how you got into mastering, because some people get into it slowly. They start out as producing and mixing, and some people have more of a quick start into mastering. And I was just curious what your relationship with mastering was and how you got to where you are today, where you're basically exclusively just mastering projects.
Yeah, for sure. I started playing music in bands and recording my own bands and mixing my own stuff. And that kind of led me to mastering. I was making an album with my band, Unstoppable Death Machines, with this producer in Brooklyn. His name is Jay Braun. And one day he just looked at me and said, "I think you'd be a good mastering engineer." And he had worked with some engineers at Masterdisk, and he said, "Yeah, just write them in an email." So I wrote the Masterdisk an email, and they responded. And I went in for an interview, and I started as an intern, and then I kind of just turned it into a full-time thing somehow.
Okay, was that with Scott Hull of Masterdisk, or was someone else?
Scott was the owner,
Okay.
but I started with Howie Weinberg.
Okay.
Howie left, and then I did a full-time apprenticeship with Andy Van Det.
Okay.
Andy, took me under his wing, and we worked together for, I think, like 4 years until Masterdisk closed. And,
right.
Somewhere along the way, I kind of said, I think I could do this. I just kept going. The key is just to not stop, just to keep going. And
that's what I found too. If you
11,
just keep
12 years later, I'm still doing it. So
yeah, I think we're kind of on a similar timeline and trajectory. I mean, I was doing a lot of producing and mixing. I don't know if you found this too, where bands sometimes didn't have the budget for mastering, so you end up being the mastering person, whether you like it or not, and then you start to get calls for mastering. So I was just kind of curious how you got into mastering. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's the short story of it. But yeah, pretty much just kind of started as an intern, and then became an apprentice and assistant, and then just started doing my own projects.
Gotcha. And that would have been in New York. So what brought you to LA? Because you're in LA right now.
Yeah, I'm in LA now. I moved out here like 5 or 6 years ago, and what brought me out here, well, the climate or the ecosystem in New York just changed. Masterdisk closed. the Magic Shop closed, Avatar closed, all these legendary studios were shutting down. And I kind of saw the writing on the wall and said, let me just try something different. I grew up in New York. I lived there my whole life and I never really lived somewhere else. And, I thought if there was going to be another city to try it, LA seemed like it made sense. And seemed to be, in hindsight, it was a good move.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to go with your instincts and go with the flow. But yeah, I mean, I see it in a lot of big cities where studios are getting kicked out of their spaces because they want to turn them into apartments and stores and other things. And even I've been listening to Andrew Shep's podcast a lot. And he's been mixing out of his house for 20 years now. He said so. I mean, it's just the whole industry is changing. We talk a little bit about that because I think monitoring is so important to mastering. People when you early on in the career, it's much more fun to focus on the equipment and the gear and the knobs and all that stuff. But if I could change some things about what I did, I would have invested in monitoring a lot sooner. So I mean, you can do some great monitoring at home. And do you ever? I know not with Atmos specifically, but do you ever use headphones more than speakers, or are you mostly relying on speakers?
Yeah, I hardly ever use headphones when I
Okay,
master. I kind of just hate
interesting.
headphones in general. Um, I
Yeah, I
don't know. It's
never, I never
like
liked headphones.
something,
Yeah, I never cared for headphones either until I found the Odyssey headphones, and then I started to realize that you actually can do work on them. I'm just using these cheap Sonys for this interview purpose, but I was just kind of curious. And I always mean to ask you, what are those crazy things we're looking at behind you? They're they kind of
These
look.
are yeah, these are the Sing Cell Alphas. I use they're the rear channels for my Atmos setup here.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. We can get into some Atmos a little bit later, but again, I wanted to just sort of get your history on mastering and things like that. So yeah, as far as and I also wanted to mention the monitoring ties into the equipment conversation. As far as I can tell, you're basically or mastering all in the box, as they say, right? With software and plugins.
I'm 100% in the box these days. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so doable now. I mean, 20 years ago it would have been a little tougher, but I think I do a lot of projects myself that are all in the box. Whether it's at my studio where I still have a lot of equipment at my fingertips. A lot of times, all digital I think is the better sounding option, and then I also have a mobile setup where obviously I don't have any equipment, so I think the tools we have now are pretty incredible, and especially now that WaveLab has no dongle required. Not that it was a huge deal, but it's nice to just open up your laptop, hook up a nice interface and headphone amp and headphones, and you're doing pretty amazing work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember the first plugins, at Masterdisk, we had a hybrid setup, analog and digital. We had a whole other computer that had WaveLab as the digital part. So, we would run everything through the desk and then take a conversion into another computer. And sometimes, we would either do one or the other or a hybrid approach. And like
Right.
the main plugins back then was like the Sony Oxford stuff, like inflator, transmodulator, and then maybe whatever. I remember using like C4 on this like Surfer Blood album I did once, but like that was like the extent of like the in the box workflow at that point. And that was in 2000 and like 10 or something like that.
Yeah.
10, 11 years later, it just the tools are just so much better now. It's so some people it's indiscernible, but the quality's just gotten so good. Tech has just gotten so good that the 100% in the box workflow is just as good as my old analog workflow.
I would agree, especially when I got my new M1 laptop. I started doing some projects all in the box and just kind of seeing how clients would react. I was happy with the results, and not one person said, "Hey, I don't think you used any analog gear on this. Can you go back and run it through some
Yeah,
analog gear?" Now, there are projects where the analog gear is maybe another 10, 5, 3% for certain things, but it's nothing. I think we're at a point where it's extremely hard to tell. Perhaps like I said, indiscernible or negligible difference. It's just more of in some ways it's more of just a different way to work, you know, how do you like to work? But
Yeah, for me, like if things are just a lot faster in the box. I'm just able to do a lot more, a lot quicker, and you know
well,
that's important to me.
yeah, repeatable results, all that stuff. I'm very
Exactly.
very much not afraid to master all digital now. I do a lot of stuff that way. That kind of ties into my next question. So, did you get introduced to WaveLab? It sounds like you did through your time at MasterDisc.
Yeah, we had, I think it was WaveLab 7.5 or 8 at that
Gotcha.
point.
Okay.
Yeah, we basically used WaveLab as like a plugin box. We would just pass audio through it and then capture it back before we limited and captured in the other DAWs Pyramix. So
Interesting.
mostly
Yeah,
Pyramix and WaveLab at that point.
yeah. So for some of the younger watchers and listeners, I mean, it was very common to have one computer to play the audio, then to go through some gear on a different computer to capture it. With computers these days, I'm able to do the analog loop all with one computer and sound card. It kind of makes life simpler because then your timeline is the same. You know, the source and the capture are totally in sync. Makes life a little easier. Someone had a question of, can a beginner start in the Boxmaster? I think most definitely, especially in 2022. I mean, the tools we have now are so incredible compared to when I was a beginner. So I think you can definitely do great stuff in the box. In fact, you know, in a way it's better because with analog gear, you can definitely do some damage, whether it's, you know, over processing, your left and right channels are off balance. You know, you have an old piece of gear and you kind of have to have a certain, I would say, grade or level of converters to even make it worth going through the gear. So it gets expensive fast. So I would say anyone starting out, you know, don't feel like you have to have a desk of gear to master it all. It's almost the opposite. So in a way, like the tools are better, safer, cleaner, and great for starting. I mean, the stuff that comes with Master Rig, you know, with WaveLab is pretty comprehensive. You have EQ, saturation, multiband, compression, dynamics, a limiter, things like that. So, so before we get into anything else, was there something? Well, it sounds like you got into WaveLab sort of just kind of by nature because the studio is using it. But was there a point when you tried to not use WaveLab and then you had to come back to it because you realized something like Pro Tools or Cubase just wasn't cut out for the job? Really, is how I feel about it.
Yeah, so you know, after MasterDisc closed, I found another studio downtown in Manhattan, and they were running on like Sadie, like 2.0 or something crazy. And I brought Andy Van Det to that studio, and we kind of like convinced him to upgrade the computers, and we brought in WaveLab, WaveLab and Sequoia. But I just chose to work in WaveLab because it was a Windows computer, and I was able to use the ASIO card. You know,
Gotcha.
so I had plug-in chain, and then I had my ASIO input for the analog chain. So that was my way of doing the hybrid system, using the ASIO plugin. But after I left that studio, I just, you know, bought WaveLab for myself because I anticipated doing everything, you know, in the box at that point. I was already determined, like, okay, I'm not going to do analog anymore. And, you know, WaveLab was basically the best DAW for that workflow, in my opinion. You know, WaveLab is extremely intuitive. You know, you don't have to be a, you know, scientist. It's very easy to figure out. So that was another thing. It was just easy to use and it fit the workflow. So after I left that second studio after MasterDisc, I've just been, you know, WaveLab every day since then.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I mean, you can do like the stereo processing part of mastering in any program, but I think anyone that's busy mastering is realizing, you know, now we need to assemble the songs in the correct order, track markers. Some songs overlap. A lot of clients want metadata in the files and things like that. And then that's where you start to get away from, you know, like Pro Tools is just not going to do that, or Logic, or even Cubase or anything like that. It's just,
Yeah.
and I see so many forum posts of, you know, I've mastered my project in a mixing DAW, but now I need to do this and that and that. And in my opinion, that then you're still mastering at that point. I mean, there's still things that can go wrong. It's not like the heavy-handed bus processing that people think of when they talk about mastering, which is kind of one of my pet peeves. I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but I consider mastering to be a process, not the processing necessarily. There's more to it than just the bus processing. I mean, that's the fun part and the most noticeable part to most people. And it ties into my next question is, I mean, are you doing a lot of singles and then people eventually want to make an EP or an album out of it? Or how are you managing that? Because I'm finding that to be a little bit of a challenge where I do a couple singles here and there, and then they got 2 more new songs that are going to make up all the songs are going to be an EP. Do you ever have to go back and touch up the earlier songs, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I do. It really just depends if like the mixes are in the same planet. Sometimes they'll have there's 10 different mixers on a project. And that makes it a little challenging, but to do the singles first, which is kind of how it usually goes, you start doing 1 or 2 songs and then they throw you the album, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll go back and retouch that single or the first 2 songs to make it fit the rest of the album. But usually I get things in a pretty good place, and that kind of, I don't really have to go back too much. But I'm not, sometimes there is the single mix and then they release the album with a different mix.
Right. Yeah.
It
Sometimes
really just depends.
Yeah. Sometimes they update the mix. Sometimes what's the big curveball for me is, you do the first song and it's very different than the rest of the record. Maybe it's a quieter piece, and then you master it. You can master that fairly loud because there's not much there, and then you get the rest of the songs and they're totally different, and you're like, okay, we need to rethink this first one a little bit. And it's not like starting over, but sometimes it does need a little retouching. So I've been finding that, I still do a lot of albums where it's front to back. I do all 10 or 12 songs at one time, but I was just kind of curious how you're navigating that, because people are releasing singles so much these days.
Yeah. First. And then the other side of that is, they keep sending you singles and you just, you assume these are singles, and then they just put them all on an album without you ever knowing about it.
Yeah, that's one thing that a pet peeve of mine for sure. Because I mean, there's things you could have or would have done differently, even down to like the sequencing of the songs. There's no standard for song spacing. I mean, people think 2 seconds is standard, which in a way it is, but it also depends what you consider the end of the song to be. If it's a slow fade at the end, another 2 seconds of silence is going to feel pretty long versus a song that has a hard stop. 2 seconds can actually seem kind of short. So, I mean, I think that's where the mastering specialist and the software comes into play of like, let's put all these in one session in a montage, and how does it feel not only sonically from song to song, but spacing and timing wise. And, do you do a lot of stuff where songs crossfade ever? Are people in your world doing that? Songs that overlap?
Definitely. And for that stuff, usually it's already, well, not usually, but sometimes it's already been decided how the sequence is, and they give me a mock-up.
Right.
And then they'll give me all the mixes, just free form as they are. And then I'll just take the mock-up and just, align everything together and kind of just crossfade, and just match the reference.
Yeah, which is one of the cool things. My favorite thing about the reference tracks that WaveLab added recently, I think it was version 10. I get that a lot where people send me a mock-up, and a lot of times I just use it as a visual. I can line up transients and look at fades, and then it's easy to flip over and actually hear it to see how fast they're fading it. I just did a record. It was a 26-song album with all the songs crossfade, but they're doing vinyl. So for the vinyl version, I had to uncrossfade where the sides split, because obviously, where the vinyl sides split, you can't have crossfades, but they left enough of a tail for me to do that. But then again, on the mock-up, it was all crossfades. So yeah, the reference tracks are really useful. Are you using reference tracks for sonic things too, or more for sequencing things, or a little bit of both?
For both, yeah. Usually, if I have a good relationship with the mixer, they'll send me the non-limited mix, and then they'll send me their loud mix, and I'll always reference what the clients have been listening to, because that limited mix has been approved, right?
Oh
Um,
yeah.
the non-limited mix, no one's ever really heard, right? So you kind of, you're starting there and you're kind of matching the reference and just pressing one button to go back and forth between what I have going through my chain and what the approved reference is. That's, I do that every day, all the time.
Yeah, and for those that aren't familiar, it seems pretty basic to have two different tracks, but the point of the reference track is that it's not going through any of your processing. So let's say you have a mixing DAW and you have a bunch of plugins on the master fader for what you're trying to do. If you try to listen to a song that's already been, the rough master from the mix engineer or a previously mastered song, you don't want to hear that song through all your processing. So the genius of the reference track is that it bypasses any processing. And you're just hearing that raw file, and it's great for comparisons. So it's
Yeah.
one of those things where I don't know how I got along without it.
I used to use, there was a plugin, an AB plugin I used to use. And I had that at the end of, I think it was the playback. I can't remember which section, playback
Yeah,
process, something. I would just load a file in there and, but it was another plugin that I had to have on the screen. It was actually kind of annoying, but,
yeah, it wasn't as convenient for sure.
yeah.
Um, well, let's talk a little bit about Atmos because everyone else is talking about it. And I know you're doing some Atmos work, and I know that WaveLab currently can't do it. Dolby did recently release the Dolby Atmos album assembler, which obviously I think that's where WaveLab could come into play and probably be a little more advanced because it's already such a great mastering DAW. Um, do you find that your clients are doing Atmos because they want to, they think they need to, or they love it more than stereo, or anywhere in between there?
I think it's a little bit of all of those reasons. I find some are doing it because everyone else is. Some are doing it because they actually spent the time, listening to other, spatial mixes, and some of them think it's better than the stereo, and some of them are just doing it because it's required by the label, right? Um,
Yeah.
it's just a mixed bag of how it's coming. A lot of the Atmos stuff is label work, really. I've done maybe like maybe a handful of indie Atmos stuff. But for the most part, it's like the major labels that are doing it right now.
Yeah, that seems about right. I mean, I've had maybe three independent artists ask me if I could do Atmos, and I still was able to do the stereo. It's not like they said, "Okay, we gotta like go find someone else." They just for Atmos they use something else. I mean, in one case, it's the mix engineer that's just handling the Atmos master. So which kind of ties into a question in the live chat about Atmos albums that crossfade. I listened to Michael Romanowski, who's kind of one of the pioneers of immersive audio in general. And this maybe things have changed, but he was talking about how difficult or impossible at the time it was to have an album where songs crossfade in Atmos because there's just not enough channels and objects and things that are a little outside of my wheelhouse and knowledge. But I kind of understand the complexity because if an ADM Atmos file has 100 channels, and then you have to have them crossfade for a couple seconds, then you're doubling the channel count, and I could see how that would max out the system or just not be physically possible. Has that changed in the album renderer
I think, yeah, the
assembler?
assembler, I think, makes it a lot easier to take all your ADM files on one track. And there's a reference track in the assembler too, like WaveLab, where you can reference the stereo. So, you can match the timings and match whatever, transitions that are in the stereo. So it's easier to just have one place where you can have all your ADM files, lined up, and you can just, nudge as you need them.
Right. So I'm kind of looking forward to see if and what WaveLab could add in the Atmos space. As I mentioned yesterday, I've been meaning to explore it in headphones, at least to get familiar with the layout and the architecture, and I just have not had time to do that. But I do know that, because especially I'm only an Apple user, but I have heard that the Atmos version has to be perfectly or very, very closely in sync with the main version, because if someone's toggling between Atmos and stereo on their device, they don't want it to skip or be way off,
Yeah.
which I know has been a challenge in like the catalog work world, because back in the days of analog tape, tape machines played at slightly different speeds just because they're tape machines. And sometimes people are intentionally speeding up songs with the tape, and mastering because they thought it felt a little draggy. So it can be a challenge, I think, to do the remixing work for older stuff. But then again, even newer stuff, you have to be aware of how they assembled the stereo version. And I'm sure it all helps if you just do all the formats. So that seems to be what you're doing, is doing all the, at least with most projects I see you post, you've done the stereo and the Atmos together.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just easier to just get it all done in one place. But there's projects where I've done just the Atmos mix, and the project was already mastered, for example.
Gotcha.
So there's some projects where they come to me and they say, "Hey, we just need the Atmos mix done," and in my process, I do a mix and a master. It's all baked into one process, because I have the assembler, and it's just easier if I can have all the files in one place, and I could just knock it all out, and instead of chasing files from this other engineer, just makes everything easier.
Right. I mean, it's kind of been debatable whether mastering is needed in Atmos, and from what I understand, I guess I'm biased because I do mastering, but I feel like there is still a need for it. It's just not. It doesn't look like how stereo mastering has traditionally looked. It's more of a quality control. More of a quality control job, which is sort of, what it was back in the 60s with vinyl. I mean, the engineer's job was to take the tapes and just transfer it to lacquer and not change anything. Just make sure that it goes from one format to the other correctly without any problem. So it seems like it's kind of going back to that. I think oh, go ahead.
I always say that too. I say that the mastering for Atmos process is a lot like the vinyl process. It's really just a format, quality control. Like, you're maxed out at -18, right?
Yep.
-1 true peak. Those are your max ceilings. So you're not going to get like a noticeably, massively, louder master. You're just going to have things fine tuned, and it's mostly for translation. How it's going to sound in a room and how it's going to sound binaurally in headphones.
Right. And I think, with any type of mastering, I think one good thing about mastering is just that fresh perspective. I mean, you're hearing stuff for the first time in a lot of cases where people have been mixing it forever. So you can just say, "Hey, I think that tambourine's really loud," or "I think, your low end is a little out of control. Let's consider addressing that." I think someone is asking if, I'm not sure actually, if they're asking if Atmos files can contain metadata. It's so hard right now because on the consumer side, it's the Wild West everywhere. But I mean, on the consumer side, you're really only able to stream the Atmos file. I don't think you can buy Atmos files anywhere.
No, there is metadata, and that's the panning information.
Right, but not so much the artist and the artwork and
like
things
titles.
like that.
Yeah, no, that's not yet, at least.
All right, and this is off topic, but someone was asking about the dongle, and as of a couple months ago now, you don't need the USB dongle for WaveLab Pro. It's not going to work with WaveLab 8. You got to have WaveLab 11.1. But I've been enjoying that for a while now, just opening up my laptop, because I used to, if I would just have my laptop with me and I wanted to check a file, I'd have to open it up in WaveLab Elements, which is a little more limited, less metering, less analysis. It worked, but it's nice to have the full version of WaveLab right on my laptop wherever I am. So that was an off-topic question. Is there anything else you want to cover? I would like to do a little screen sharing before we get into some
we can do that.
Final Q&A. But I mean, as far as mastering in general, we discussed that you're all in the box, and I think that's a great way to work. And monitoring, we can just touch on this quickly. I don't want to get in too much of a gear talk, but I think are you using the Key 3 speakers or PMC or both?
I'm on the Key 3 BXTs now. Yeah.
Okay, so that has the bass extension.
Yeah, they're pretty pretty amazing. The it, it's all about the translation. It just sounds accurate everywhere I play it, like in the car. Even if I check it on the Apple AirPod Maxes, um, it's just I've been doing like a lot of version ones, which saves me a ton of time, and that's the main thing for me. Like, how can I maximize my time and efficiency?
Yeah, and
It's
that's one thing very early on in my like mixing career, I definitely skimped on the monitoring situation, and then you're banging your head against the wall of, why is this taking so long and not sounding as good as something else? And I recently upgraded my monitoring was already pretty good, but I recently upgraded this year, and it's like I'm just working so much faster and confidently. It's like I just know it's going to sound great. It's kind of
yeah,
interesting because like the better you don't want monitors that make everything sound great, but when you have the right monitors, you realize sometimes how much little needs to be done. Sometimes you're like, this
yeah,
already, it doesn't need a lot of processing. Whereas with mediocre to not great monitoring, you're kind of just chasing problems that don't exist or overcorrecting, or it's like wearing the wrong prescription glasses. It might you might draw a picture that looks good with the wrong prescription, but it doesn't mean it's going to translate anywhere.
yeah. That's a good analogy. I like that one.
So someone says there's a lucky dog behind you. I think Wesley took off, but if you want to show us, we're gonna flirt with danger here, and I'm gonna switch it over to Mike's screen share, and he's just going to kind of show us a little bit of his WaveLab layout. You can tell us as much or as little as you want. You could even go into, when you're starting a fresh session, how do you create if you're doing it in the editor or the montage, and how do you
Yeah,
get it in there, and how do you think about stuff? I personally put everything in a montage if I'm doing an album or EP, and just pick the first song. I don't always start with the first song on the record, but pick a song to start with first and then try to get the other ones working well. But, just kind of show us how you approach it. An EP or an album would be awesome to see.
yeah,
You don't have to give away any secrets, but just a little bit of what you like to do. I think people like to see this layout, and I can already see that you have two reference tracks, which would be interesting to explain.
yeah,
The reference tracks are the ones with the big R, and then I'll shut up and let you talk.
yeah. So these are the reference tracks with the R. I just press one button, I get that, and whatever's on the reference track is essentially bypassed by whatever I have in the master section here. Um, so here, this track, I usually put all my mixes that need to be mastered, mixes for mastering, flat mixes, unlimited, all on one track here. And then here I'll have my limited refs. So these are the approved mixes. So it's really easy for me to, just press play here. And usually I use the master section as my console. It's probably, not the most efficient way to do it, but it works for me with this workflow. So I'll have whatever processing here in the master section, and whatever's on this mix track is being processed through the master section. And I have the inspector here, and sometimes, you could put a plug-in on a clip or on the entire track. So depending, if there's something that I need before it hits whatever I have in my virtual console, which is the master section, I can add whatever I need to with the inspector. So these, inspector goes first, and then master section
Yeah.
is second.
I like that approach. Just to interrupt quickly, it reminds me a little bit of how I work when I'm doing analog gear. I think sometimes people think when I'm using analog gear, I'm doing drastic changes to the gear on every song. But what I do is kind of find a broad stroke approach that's going to work for the whole project.
Right.
And then any really specific stuff I do in the box before it hits that console or virtual console, that's kind of where the heavy lifting happens, which you could do with clip effects. And then for those that aren't familiar with WaveLab, clip effects are plugins you put literally right on each file that you see. It's not on a channel strip or a track or anything. It's literally right on each clip. Other programs like Reaper has item effects, Sequoia has object, and WaveLab calls it clip effects. And when Mike was saying track effects, he means the actual audio track.
Yeah,
Um,
the
so that
entire track. Yeah.
that would affect all the songs equally, which can be good. But sometimes, due to the terminology of WaveLab, some people will say track, and they mean CD track or album track. But it's always good to make that differentiation. And then the master sections after that. So basically, you're kind of going song by song and then committing that to a new file. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm doing song by song. I'll print. Usually, if I have clip effects or anything with the inspector, obviously I'm printing it through the montage. But if I don't, I'll just take it up here and process it just as an audio file. The other thing I like to do is the batch processor. So if I have alternates like cleans, instrumentals, acapellas, all that stuff, you can load them all here. I can go up here, grab whatever, and then I could just do a batch process of everything. I don't have to do real-time prints anymore. So the batch processor is a big part of the expediency of my in-the-box workflow. But, if we're just working on the main, tracks, I'm just printing one song at a time. And then what I'll do is I'll put my version on the top reference track. You'll see I label everything MT sequentially 1, 2, 3, 4.
Gotcha.
So with this, say I, print it and I want to try something else in the chain, just go back to my master section and, I got to tweak whatever. And I could reference between the limited approved mix and whatever I just printed. So that's the huge help of the reference track. It just allows for quick A/Bing.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't really say, maybe it's obvious, but the reference track also has no danger of being part of your rendered audio, so you never have to remember to mute it or disable it.
Yeah, it's always bypassed if it's not engaged, basically.
Yeah. So it's really safe way to work. Someone is asking, and I was kind of wondering too. So because you're using the master section as a console, he's wondering if do you save those as presets?
Yeah, every song gets saved as a preset. So essentially, the preset or the virtual version of a slate, or your session notes. So those are the recalls, and that's that makes the repeatability and the recall better than an analog recall, because if the tubes, anything can happen. The variables are so vast in the analog domain. Here I could just recall it, a song, and it'll be exactly how it was when I printed it. So
yeah, I like that. And that's kind of why I like doing these, is there's so many different ways to use WaveLab. I mean, I know I've mentioned I never touched the master section for various reasons, but I do like the idea of using it as like a virtual console where it's a little more fluid. And, if you, let's say it's a band that did a whole record in a weekend with all the same instruments, that's a bit of an extreme example. But if the songs are very similar musically and instrumentation wise, then you have a nice jumping off point for the next song. In my opinion, do you ever optimize the level of the mixes with the normalizer, or do you just kind of take them as they are and then work with it that way?
I mean, I've seen you do the meta normalizer. I just haven't found how that works for me yet.
Gotcha.
And I just kind of like the way it's been delivered is what I work with. Like, I don't want to, a lot of the mixers I work with are very particular. And the second I start regain staging, their mixes, there's always, it's just always better to kind of just work from where it is.
I agree. Yeah,
for me,
I agree with that. When there's already, I don't always do it when there's already some or a lot of limiting on the mix, but when I get mixes that have no peak limiting at all, I find that it's not really a difference either way. Another question is, well, the question itself is, how do you print in the box? And I guess, are you saying that once you are happy with a song, do you use the render function, or is there a...
Yeah. So depending, if I have clip effects in the on each clip here, I'll have to render from the montage. If
Gotcha.
I don't have any, if I don't have any clip effects or track any montage processing, and I'm just all in the master section, I'll just pop out here, because when I have my render window, it's all ready to go to the right folder, instead of here, like, here I'm usually just rendering like that, CD tracks in a group, and I have my presets here. So
Yep.
for just the file naming, rendering fluidity, I like to just open the file in the editor and just print from the montage. But if I have, like in this one, I just threw up whatever, this Fab Filter plugin. So I don't know, if I have this going on this track, I'll have to either highlight whatever this one, or I'll just do the selection and auto select, and I'll render it from here. Just depends what's going on with each clip, in terms of the inspector processing here.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no shortage of place to insert plugins in WaveLab, which again, I think that's what kind of separates it from a mixing DAW. Is, I mean, I think Pro Tools has clip effects now, but it's only with the native Avid plugins and not necessarily all the third-party ones that you might like to use. So that's, so to me right there, that's just because it's kind of like, well, like what you have now, you have everything on one track. I see some people that do like the stair step thing where they have like 12 audio tracks and they're like a stair step
and like step out like this kind of.
Yeah, one song on every, well, not even that. That's more staggered. I'm talking about like literally, if it's a 12 song album, they have 12 audio tracks and it's just really staggered. But in my opinion, that takes up a lot of visual. By that point, the waveforms are super tiny. And then depending on the DAW, if you have 12 audio tracks with a bunch of plugins, that's using a lot of computer power, like all the time. It's easy to bog down your computer. Whereas if you have a layout like yours, it's way less taxing on the computer. Is what I found.
I'm all, the easier the better, always, in whatever situation and whatever case. It's like I always try to make things as least complex as possible.
Yeah, it keeps it real simple, and just little things too. Like, well, I guess we can get into that too. So you're just kind of going song by song. You're not really caring about the song spacing, I assume. Do you do kind of an assembly? Like, let's say we're doing an album.
Yep. So
this is where it really comes into play.
Yeah, for sure. So once in this case, I printed everything. These are just 2 alternate mixes that didn't get treated. But, once I have all my EQs that I'm happy with, I'll usually just, highlight everything, copy it, and then go into another space and paste it. And then this is where I, get rid of my meters and everything. And I could zoom in and, do my tails this way, whatever. And this is where I kind of do whatever. There's no crossfades on this album, but if I were to do crossfades, I keep everything just on one track. Something like that, whatever. I don't really do this. For me, it's just a little redundant. I just rather have everything in one place. And then if I need to substitute a file, this replace audio track is great, because then I can just, substitute the same exact mix just with a different processing.
Yep.
And the waveform will, maintain its time code.
That comes a lot. That comes up a lot. Like, for those that maybe don't know, a lot of times we'll master something and they'll say, we love it, but we're going to send you a new mix with the vocal turned up a hair. Or my favorite one is, we love it, but somehow all the backing vocals got muted. Can we send you a new file? I've had that happen. Like you said, a lot of times the non-limited version has never been listened to, and that's where mistakes can come into play. So the nice thing with WaveLab is it has a replace audio file feature where you can, just keep all your same settings. Everything's the same. You just pop in. It's just referencing a new file. And there are ways to have it maintain sync or adapt. Sometimes the file is longer on purpose because they chopped off the ending note too soon or something. So there's ways to maintain sync or not, but it's a really cool feature that I don't recall existing in Pro Tools. I feel like in Pro Tools, if someone sent you a new file, it's a lot of dragging and eyeballing and zooming really close.
There's a way to do it in Pro Tools from the clip bin. You just have to hold down like one of these Control Shift and then drag it onto the file that you're replacing it.
Okay.
I've been doing that with the Atmos stuff. Like sometimes, they're replacing whatever the sound with something else, and it's just a different balance or different EQ that they did. And instead of just re-importing everything, I just throw it in the clip bin, and you could drag it, and it'll lock. So there's a way to do it in Pro Tools.
Okay, that's good to know. But yeah, generally speaking, it's great to have an option to just replace the file just directly. It's really fast. Also, I've seen some people do that for alternate versions. Once the main version's approved, they'll do a save as of some kind and load in the instrumental or the clean mix and things like that. Depending on the kind of music you're doing, you end up with a lot of clean versions as well that basically need the same processing, but stuff like that can save you time.
Yeah, and then once we have everything lined up, I'll add my CD markers, label everything properly. Everything's here, ready to go.
Yeah,
and and then the best way for me to render out everything is to do the render all CD tracks in the group, and then it'll just put everything out, and I have my presets with. I can name everything the way I want. I could add the numerical counters and everything. So once you get to this point, it's, you're at the home stretch here, and you just have to make sure your markers are good. You're not cutting anything off. Markers are in the right place,
Yeah, all the detail stuff. I mean, I used to assemble a lot of DDPs for a CD company, and they would get just folders of WAV files, usually from the mix engineer that was also mastering it. And the lack of attention to detail was sometimes alarming. Files just with 3 seconds of mostly dead space, but also maybe like some hiss that just cuts off abruptly, or, just kind of sloppy work when it comes to the track markers and stuff like that. So that's where something like WaveLab, kind of like you have it now, it's just so big and in your face. It's really easy to just double check where all the markers are, make sure it's at a clean point, whether it's, songs that have silence between them or songs that crossfade. It's just, I think it's just a nice tool for the job. Trying to do this in a mixing DAW is a little bit you can do it, but it's a little bit the wrong tool for the job. So,
yeah. And then, once you have your markers, you can open up your CD window here, and you can check the start of each track and the transition from, one track to the next, which is helpful.
Yeah, just a quick double check. Because as you move, sometimes you move things around, and, the way I work, the markers are tied to the clips. So if you move the clip, like the marker moves too. And then also, like, if you move like the third clip, everything after it moves equally. I think you have 2 things selected, but
yeah,
like let's say
when I do the comp, I usually throw this the ripple, so if I'm moving one thing, I'm moving the rest behind it as well.
That's really what you want, because like you said, down to the version ones. I'm doing so many records now where they love the sound. It's just like, can we add 2 seconds or a second between these 2 songs? And it's easy to do, but WaveLab makes it even easier by shifting all the files after it. So like the relationship between all the other songs stays the same. May seem like a small detail, but it's a huge time saver, and it's a really important thing to be aware of, because when I see people doing it in Pro Tools or Logic, I'm like, that's got to be super annoying when someone wants 1 second added between just 2 songs. You got to be very careful that you're not messing anything else up when you're making that change. So,
yeah, definitely.
Well, is there anything else you want to talk about with WaveLab? You covered quite a bit, and feel free to cover more, but I think that was a great little walkthrough of
Uh,
how you use WaveLab.
yeah, I mean, the fades, we have the fade ins and fade outs, you could do this, you could select, different types of fades. That's easy to do. Everything is really, there's a million ways to make this software work for you. Like I said before, it's extremely intuitive, and anything you don't know, just go on your WaveLab group and ask, hey, how do you do
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, and I'm glad that it's grown into a pretty decent community. I mean, I remember when there was like 5 people in it, and I had to invite one of my friends that didn't even use WaveLab just to like get someone in there just to see if it worked.
Yeah.
But now it's grown into a nice community. One of the very first questions, and I think we're going to transition into like a general Q&A. If anyone has any questions they want to fire, I can read the live chat. One of the very first questions, I didn't want to jump into it because it was kind of off top. It wasn't really, it was kind of well, anyways, the question was, the difference between 24-bit and 32-bit mastering. And I was just going to add that, when you make a WaveLab montage, it only asks you what sample rate you want it to be. It doesn't ask you the bit depth. And that's just because it's kind of what I call bit depth agnostic, where it can handle whatever bit depth file you load into. It's more about the processing that happens when you are working. Anytime you add digital processing, it's working at 32 or 64-bit floating point. And then you just have to be careful when you're rendering the files that you're, dithering or not dithering if you don't want to, but just be aware that the bit depth is changing. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but
No, I mean, the difference is just more headroom in terms of bit depth between 32 and 24.
yeah,
But
that's the more direct answer.
32 is largely like not used. All the deliverables now are 24 bits.
Yeah,
So,
it's not.
I render everything in 32. And then, all these files here are 32 bits. And then when I export, see, it's stuck at 32 here, but I'll have a 24-bit preset right there, and then export everything for deliverables. I think 16-bit is like gone. I think that's a thing of the past at this point.
Well, except for CD Baby. I get a lot of independent clients that use CD Baby, and it's a little bit frustrating because,
Yeah, you're right. I actually went through that last week with a client, and they asked me for 16-bit files, and I was like, "Who's it for?" And they said, "CD Baby."
yeah,
So,
the last one. I mean, you can.
still on CD specs.
Yeah, they should have picked a better name, but you can submit 24-bit and higher sample rate to CD Baby, but you have to set it up as a separate release. So your client is paying for 2 releases, and they only send that to Apple, which is kind of crazy because they could send it to Amazon and Spotify and Tidal, but they're a little behind the times. That's a whole different topic. But yeah, I'm the same way. I render everything in floating point because you basically want to reduce the bit depth last. Very last thing, even after any crossfades, because even if you take 24 or 16-bit audio and crossfade it, it becomes floating point in that crossfaded section. And then, of course, as you add plugins. So, yeah, keeping it 32-bit or 64-bit float till the very end, I think, is a best practice. You don't really have a choice. When people say they're mixing in 24-bit, I think that's actually not correct. And the way that a lot of programs are set up to mislead you that way, because if you start a new Pro Tools session, it says, what bit depth and sample rate do you want? And the bit depth is really just for the recorded files, like when you're recording a new file, because your audio interface is only 24-bit, but the processing that happens is floating point. And again, WaveLab doesn't even ask you bit depth when you start a project. It just says, what sample rate do you want your... Now, it does ask you bit depth if you're going to record a file. That's a different story. But when you're starting a montage like you did, it really just asks for sample rate. And the bit depth is really not really a factor until you start rendering. And again, the deliverables, like you said, 24-bit is basically the highest deliverable that people are wanting. 32-bit is good for archival and, intermediate work, but really never gets delivered that way. So, Well, we're coming up on the 55-minute mark, so I appreciate your time. If there are any final questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you're watching this later, Mike did reference the WaveLab users group on Facebook. That's a good place to ask questions about WaveLab. WaveLabHelp.com is a website that I maintain. It has all these videos. It has some of my preferences and settings to get you started and things like that. The Steinberg WaveLab forum is also a very good resource. PG, who is the developer of WaveLab, he's on there very often, so it's great that you can ask the person that invented and still develops WaveLab any questions or report an issue or ask for, if you make a good case for a feature request, a lot of times he'll consider adding it. So that's another bonus of WaveLab.
Need some ADM support for WaveLab.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a bigger company decision than just one person, but I would agree. I think I'd be more tempted to, not that the Dolby stuff is that expensive. I mean, the speakers get expensive and all that, but the actual software to get into it is pretty inexpensive in my opinion. For me, it's just more about having the time to do it. But I would like to see some Atmos integration in WaveLab too. I mean, I know Nuendo can do it. It's still kind of early, but we'll see what happens with it. But I appreciate you sharing your insights on it and things like that. Looks like there are no more questions. A couple thank yous. So again, thank you for joining us. Thanks everybody for watching. And I'll do this again next month, and we'll have some more guests on in the future as well. So have a good evening or whatever you're having when you watch this, and we'll talk to you soon.
Cool. Thanks, JP.
No problem. Sorry.